For our project, we decided to create a video comprised of 4 interviews that we conducted with Spanish-speaking friends who are both heritage and second language learners. We then used our class resources and outside sources to analyze and reframe their responses. Our original sample was intentionally religious Spanish speakers, and we wanted to talk about how Spanish influences religion and vice versa and how those two interact. But through our interviews, we actually found that ideas around language and intelligence and academics were much more salient than the religious aspect. We asked our participants to answer our questions however they felt most comfortable, in English or in Spanish. Of the 3 heritage speakers, 1 spoke English, 1 spoke mostly English with a little bit of Spanglish, and 1 used all 3, Spanish, English, and Spanglish. Our second language learner actually spoke all completely in Spanish. And we used several resources from class to unpack and analyze what our participants shared with us about their language uses and their experience, and then we also brought some outside sources in as well.
We started out wanting to explore the experiences of Spanish speakers in religious communities around Eugene, but as we conducted our research, we found that our participants demonstrated very specific ideas about language usage. So, in this video, we're going to talk about our methodology for the project, we're going to show you some clips, and then we're going to show you our analysis of the clips. Finally, we will talk about how we can reframe ideas about language in a way that is more accurate. Our argument for this research is that we need to reframe how we see Spanish in the US so that all people can feel more comfortable expressing who they are as individuals and as community members.
Well, growing up, I would go to Spanish mass most of the time, actually like solely Spanish mass until I started like doing confirmation and things on my own. That's when I started getting into English masses, but it was always Spanish mass and like a Spanish community, Spanish speaking community. And then like individually, sometimes I'll say like prayers in Spanish because like, I don't know, some part of my brain is just like I'm more comfortable with Spanish at the moment. But yeah, that's pretty much, it was just like a Spanish speaking community, so I always had that kind of background, like going into religious practices, I would say.
In these clips, Danny speaks about being raised in a majority Latino community down in Los Angeles. He says that the majority of his religious life when he was younger was Spanish speaking and was around the Latino culture. And then it changed when he started to get into confirmation age and when he started to going to mass with his older friends and doing things for himself. He started to integrate English into his religious life. And now in Eugene, he knows that there are lots of masses and lots of recursos for Spanish speakers in different religions, and Catholicism especially, but he still chooses to go to the English masses with his friends and with his peers. On uscatholic.org and in the American Magazine, I found 2 articles about Spanish in religion and in Catholicism specifically. In the first, titled Latino Catholics Caught Between Two Worlds, the gap is identified between young Latinos' parents' culture and their peers. This is cited as the largest problem Catholic churches have with young Latino Catholics. They may feel caught between 2 worlds, 2 identities, and in Danny's case, he has transitioned very well from speaking Spanish at a young age in his religious life into now speaking almost completely English. And this does not mean he's giving something up by not attending Spanish Mass, but when he said that little phrase about how sometimes the prayers just come to him in Spanish and he just needs that moment to express himself in the Spanish language, that indicates to me that there is a piece of his spiritual life or a piece of him and his identity that he really relates to God better in that way through the Spanish language in certain aspects or in certain moments of his life. So it is important to him in that way.
Bueno, sí, creo que hay una manera de hablar inglés y de hablar español correctamente. Creo eso porque soy tutora de inglés, entonces la gramática, el sintaxis y comunicación es muy importante para mí. Y ese feeling, también existe en mi comprendimiento de español.
Like the border women in Leticio Galindo's Language Use and Language Attitudes, a study of border women, Ali also admits that she sometimes has some apprehension when speaking Spanish. The border women have their own preoccupations for their Spanish, their ways of speaking, their dialects, and for the way other women in the border and different cities see them, if you remember from that article that we read. I want to acknowledge that Hallie has a perfect Spanish in mind when she says quiero hablar perfectamente o sí, hay una manera de hablar correctamente. It's that she's efforting and she's putting in the work to reach this perfect Spanish, and I think a lot of us have this in mind, and I don't want to discount those efforts because she's trying to be able to communicate well with Spanish speakers, and I don't think that's an effort that we should ever try to discount. Where the problems begin is with the idea of purism. I found an article published in the International Multilingual Research Journal that was called Unpacking Ideologies of Linguistic Purism. It says that language teachers use translanguaging, which is when students move fluidly across multiple languages and dialects in their everyday interactions. In the observation, it was actually discovered that this actually encouraged language separation and then enforced purist ideologies to keep Spanish Spanish and English English. Ali never mentions the word pure exactly, but she is searching for something that she will be praised for. She's searching for a perfect non-accent accent, a never-ending vocabulary, or tenses always perfectly conjugated by her privileged bilingual tongue.
My mom is pretty intelligent, my dad's pretty intelligent, but they they feel more comfortable speaking in Spanish than in English.
Throughout his interview, Frankie repeatedly expressed the idea that English is tied to intellectualism and intelligence, while Spanish is tied to emotion. And although he might relate to these languages in different ways, the fact that he feels the need to say that his parents are intelligent despite not speaking English reflects a greater cultural notion regarding language.
I feel to be truly bilingual is that you can express yourself in two languages. In English, I can express myself, but in Spanish, I can like express myself like 70% of the time. I'm a very emotional guy, and I think Spanish has a lot of emotion in it. So sometimes when I get angry or get really emotional, my brain just automatically switches to Spanish, and then I'm like, oh, I see something different in my faith that I don't think I would have saw if I was thinking in English. The same thing for English. You know, you can. I find it's easier to think intellectually in English because English encourages more like less emotion, more facts, more thought, and I think Spanish is more romantic, more energy, more screw it, I have to go do something, with my emotion kind of language. When I was in elementary school, in like the late '90s, in Oregon or in my section of Oregon, teachers were encouraged to kind of take Hispanic students' accents away or teach them how to speak English properly. And one of the results of that is that I don't have an accent. I don't have an accent when I speak Spanish. I've been told that I sound like a Caucasian person speaking Spanish because I don't like fluff up my Spanish, which it sounds very professional, and as a result, like Spanish people kind of judge me, like they kind of believe that I kind of got whitewashed, like I'm not proud of being Hispanic, which is hurtful, but at the same time, I'm like, I tell them the story, this is what happened to me, yeah.
In this portion of the interview, Frankie tells us a lot. First, that his accent was diminished and eventually erased, even by teachers who speak Spanish themselves. Second, that he believes professional Spanish is a Spanish without an accent. And third, that Frankie's lack of an accent somehow makes him less Mexican. So how can we unpack this? As Lakoff explained, we are naturally predisposed to categorization, or stereotyping, as part of our cognitive functioning. In other words, we are constantly categorizing people and ideas so that we can better understand them. In the case of Frankie, he shows us that Spanish without an accent is somehow categorized as more professional, as upper class, and as whitewashed. So it's identified as desirable. Now, Lehman investigates language ideologies and explains that, quote, seemingly common sense and taken for granted notions about language are complicit in the reproduction of social hierarchies. So this notion that one accent or way of speaking is better than another is actually reproducing a social hierarchy. It's reproducing the notion that one group of people and one way of speaking and one way of living is inherently better than another. We can also see from Frankie's interview that people believe in language authenticity. In other words, the way you speak a language determines what social group or social status you're part of, at least what you're perceived to be part of. Now let's dive into Cassie's interview. When I asked Cassie if her religious community accepted her Spanish, she responded with this.
I have had instances where I've been to other communities where they're kind of iffy about it, or they just are straight up like, don't speak it. We want everyone to understand. But it's like, yeah, but English really isn't the language of the United States, is it? So, and I mean, as far as I know, when I hear that, it really bothers me, and there have been times where I've had to tell people, like, no, like, this is my language, like, this is a part of who I am. No, unless you're in academics, you're writing for La Academia, or like, obviously there's a structure to it, grammatically, so like linguistically, but when you're communicating with other people from different regions, from different parts of the world, like, there really isn't one certain way to speak it.
In this clip, Cassie demonstrates how we can reframe language to people who reject or erase other languages. She also calls out the logical fallacy that Spanish is intentionally exclusionary just because other people can't understand it all the time. Finally, Cassie also talks about the phenomenon of categorizing and language policing.
I had a 5th grade teacher. She would correct me every time I would say ain't, like, that ain't right, and she'd be like, isn't, and I would be like, okay, woof. I would have cousins who would make fun of me for my Spanish, which is funny because now I'm a Spanish major.
We learned a lot conducting these interviews, and I think one of the most important takeaways is that when we restrict a language, we are restricting an entire identity and possibly an entire culture.
Yeah, and I think another large takeaway that we had is that we should all try to be more conscious of what we're saying and what the people around us are saying. And in the conversations we were having, our interviewees actually didn't realize that some of the things they were saying are examples of these deep-rooted ideologies. Either they did realize it and they said, yep, I still have these beliefs even though this, and this, or they actually didn't know what they were saying was part of these ideologies.
Exactly. These ideologies are so strong in our society that people who speak non-English languages even express some sort of agreement with these language ideologies.
Yeah. And so I think something that I wrote in my reflection to Claudia about this class is that it has given me a lot of courage to be able to start these conversations. And I would really hope that everyone else in this class also has that courage, because it's important to say, oh, you just said this thing, and it actually is a little bit discriminatory in this way, insert blank here, it's a little bit sexist, it's a little bit racist or homophobic, and, this is why it's that, and let's talk about it, let's have that conversation. And so one, it's hard but very important to have that courage to start that conversation, but then after that conversation is started, to have the patience and to have the knowledge to intelligently express and have that conversation.
I think the best way to combat easily and quickly the commodification of different languages and different groups of people, as well as the essentialization that happens, is by validation. We can validate the way that other people speak, we can validate the way that we speak and how that's an expression of who we are. and to continue having those conversations, just like you were saying. So get out there and validate people. That's what we think you should do. Yeah.